When you're working on a woodworking project, the first thing that you want to do before you start gluing boards together is to make sure that you're working with lumber that is perfectly flat, with top and bottom parallel, and both sides also parallel to one another and square to the top and bottom. Now that might sound obvious, but it's very rarely the case before you do your magic on the board. So what I'm going to do is just walk you through a very simple sequence of producing S4S lumber that is flat top and bottom, parallel sides that are square to the top and bottom. I'm going to start with a board that has a lot of problems, that has one end that is about an 1/8 inch thicker than the other end, one end that is about an inch narrower than on the wide end, and it's got some twisting and cupping in it as well. So lots of problems with this board. I'm going to walk it through this simple sequence to produce a perfect board. At the end of the video, I'll then walk through some scenarios if you don't have a jointer, if your jointer is not large enough, and anything else that I think of along the way. Feel free to ask questions down below. I'll address whatever I can, but hopefully I'll preemptively answer most of them as I go through the sequence. All right, I'm over at the jointer because that's where the sequence begins. I'm going to start by face jointing, and that means I'm going to plane off the surface on one of the faces of the board and make it perfectly flat. As a starting point, as I showed you, this board is nowhere near flat. It's rocking and rolling. So I'm going to find my flattest side and start there. And I like to start it with the crown down. So if it is rocking, I like to start it with the crown down so that I don't tip the front end into the jointer. All right, my first pass produced a pretty good surface, a great surface over about 3/4 of the area, but I can still see that there's some rough marks. I'm going to run it through again until I get all those rough marks removed, and I've got a perfectly flat surface. All right, that's what I'm going for. 2 passes through the jointer, and I have my jointer set for a really light cut. I don't mind running it through a second pass. I'd rather do that than waste wood by taking too thick of a pass. Also, I feel like I get a better surface finish. So really nice surface on that. Now, while I'm at the jointer, I'm going to take that surface and put it up against the fence on the jointer, and I'm going to run it through, and I'm going to joint one edge. That pass cleaned it up. I now have a perfectly flat edge that is square to a perfectly flat face. Now I'm going to head over to the planer. All right, the job over here at the planer is about as simple as it gets. I'm going to take my flat face surface, put it down on the planer bed, and I'm going to run it through, and I'm just going to run it through a couple light passes until I get a flat surface on the top that I know will be parallel to the flat surface on the bottom. All right, 3 light passes was all it took, and now I've got flat face on top and bottom, parallel to one another, and one square edge that is square to both of those surfaces. All right, now maybe you're thinking, head back to the jointer and just clean up that final edge and you're done. But if you remember, the board is an inch wider on this end than on this end. So if I run it through the jointer like this, and I will, it will square it up to both flat surfaces, but it will not be parallel to the opposing edge. I'm just going to do that and prove it. All right, it took a handful of passes through the jointer to clean up that edge, But ultimately, I could run it through the jointer as many times as I want, and I'm not going to fix the problem. So I can measure it on one end, and it's about 3 3/4 of an inch. And on the other end, it's about just a hair over 3 inches. So I'm still about 3/4 of an inch, and that's random. It could have gotten bigger than the 1 inch that it was out at the beginning. It's just kind of random. So what I need to do now to make my final fix is to head over to the table saw. All right, now to make the edges parallel, I'm going to take the skinny end of the board and I'm going to put either edge up against the fence, and I'm going to make sure that I'm cutting off a 1/16 or so of an inch on the narrow end of the board. Lock it down. All right, now I've got lumber that is perfect. Top and bottom flat, parallel to one another. Sides are square to top and bottom and parallel to one another, and it's the same width on each end of the board. Perfect lumber. All right, now I have a blade in my saw that I love, and it produces perfect glue line rips. So this is glue up ready. If you get a little bit of chatter on the side of your board and you want to take it back to the jointer for one more light pass before you glue it up, no problem. All right, let me just address a couple scenarios that come up a lot. 1, what if I don't have a jointer? 2, what if I don't have a planer? 3, what if I don't have a jointer or planer that are big enough? Let's take those in order. All right, if you don't have a jointer, remember the jointer is responsible for 2 things: establishing a flat face and jointing crisp edges for glue joints. So first thing, dealing with the flat face. Assuming you have a planer, what you can do is use a hand plane. Now, if you're not a big hand tool person, don't worry about it. All you have to do is get it ballpark close. And so start by understanding where you're rocking and mark your high corners. Okay, so I have a little bit of a rock on this board. Not much, but if it's worse, it's easier to troubleshoot. So I'm just rocking it on the table and understanding where I have high spots, and I'm going to mark those. So I believe if I remove material from these 2 edges just slightly, I should be able to get a flat face. Kind of gently feathered and check it frequently because you don't want to go too far with it. All right, so that's stopped the rocking, about 99% of the rocking. I can still feel a little bit. But now what you do is basically you're going to go over, flip that side down, run it through the planer until you have a flat side on the top. Now that becomes your first jointed surface. Flip it over, run it through, and now you're ready to go for your next step. So now, if you don't have a jointer, you have to deal with ripping a straight edge. So let's head over to the table saw and talk about that. One good way to establish a jointed edge on the table saw is to use a sled like this, which you can buy or make. All I'm going to do is align my board to the edge of the jig so that I lose as much as possible, but I cut all the way cleanly through the board and get a crisp edge. All right, if you don't have a planer, the 2 main options as I see it is first, get a planer. And if that's really not an option, then secondly, get good at using a hand plane. So in the previous step where I showed flattening a face using a hand plane, flip that side down, that's going to be your reference surface, and use a marking gauge to establish a depth line around the perimeter, and use that as your guide. You would do that all the way around, of course, and use that as your guide and flatten, remove wood till you get down to that point. All right, and finally, what do you do if your jointer or your planer aren't big enough? And nobody's jointer and planer are big enough. So I have an 8-inch jointer and an 18-inch planer, and I run into this limitation all the time. So what I do, there are a lot of different workarounds out there, and there's a lot of rigmarole that you can go through, and I think those are all, there are a lot of valid approaches. What I do in every situation like that on the jointer, when I'm starting my S4S sequence, I will just cut the board to an acceptable width for my jointer, joint it, and then glue them back together. It's really not that much extra work. You can create an invisible glue line, and the glue line is, as everyone knows, is as strong as the wood itself. So really nothing lost there. On the planer, what I do is, so when I'm gluing up panels, a lot of times they'll be wider than 18 inches. I will glue up in sequence. So if I have a 25-inch panel that I need to glue up, I'll glue up a 12 and a 13-inch width panel, process them all the way through, and then glue them together at the end. And then I'll just have one joint to focus on as I'm gluing up the panel, so I can get that thing dead flush. Almost requires no work whatsoever. Light work with a random orbital sander, and the joint is gone. With that, let me know if you have questions. I'm pretty responsive and getting back to people, and I hope you'll subscribe and come back to the Tool Metrics channel. I do a lot of woodworking and wood turning videos, so hope you come back. Thanks so much for watching.